The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek over the horizon when the deep, guttural growl of heavy machinery shattered the morning calm. The walls of my house trembled as if the earth itself was protesting the intrusion. At first, I thought it was a dream, some lingering nightmare from the depths of my subconscious. But the persistent grinding of metal and the beeping of reversing trucks dragged me into full consciousness. My heart raced as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. I grabbed my robe and shuffled toward the window, my mind still foggy with sleep. The scene outside was surreal. My driveway, my perfectly maintained, freshly sealed, meticulously designed driveway, was gone. In its place stretched a freshly paved road, cutting through my property like a scar. The road led nowhere, disappearing into the dense woods at the edge of my land. My stomach churned as I stared at the destruction, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a driveway. It was my property, my sanctuary. And now it was gone. Anger bubbled up from deep within me, hot and unrelenting. I slammed my coffee mug onto the counter, ignoring the scalding liquid that splashed onto my hand, and stormed outside in my slippers. A cluster of construction workers in neon vests milled around a steamroller, chatting casually as if they hadn't just obliterated my personal property. The sharp, acrid scent of hot asphalt burned my nostrils as I stomped toward the nearest worker, a lanky man with a patchy beard who was lazily jotting something down on a clipboard. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" My voice cut through the early morning air like a whip. The worker barely looked up from his clipboard. "HOA orders, sir," he said, flipping through his paperwork. "We're extending the road for better traffic flow." I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. This isn't a public road. This was my driveway. The man finally glanced up at me, seemingly unfazed. "Well, it's a road now." Blood pounded in my ears. "Who approved this? Who gave you permission to tear up my property?" The worker shrugged. "That's an HOA question. We just do what's on the work order." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. There was no point in arguing with the crew. They were just doing their jobs. No, the real culprits here were the HOA, my neighborhood's homeowners association. They had always been a nightmare, enforcing absurd rules with an iron fist. They once fined a neighbor $500 because his Christmas lights were still up on January 3rd. Now, it seemed they had gone from petty annoyances to outright illegal activities. I spun on my heel and marched toward the one person responsible for this mess, Margaret Hargrove, the HOA president. Margaret had been running the Homeowners Association like a dictator for years. She was the type to peer out her window with binoculars, just waiting to catch someone in violation of an arbitrary rule. If anyone had authorized this insanity, it was her. The short walk to Margaret's house did nothing to cool my anger. When I reached her front door, I jabbed the doorbell with more force than necessary. A few seconds later, the door swung open to reveal Margaret's ever-practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She was dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks, her hair perfectly coiffed. Everything about her screamed perfection, but I knew better. "Oh, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "What a lovely surprise." "Cut the act, Margaret," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. Why did I wake up to a construction crew paving over my driveway? Her smile barely faltered. "Oh dear, you must have missed the email. The board voted to extend the community road for better accessibility." I narrowed my eyes. I never received any email. Margaret's expression remained eerily composed. "Well, it was sent out last month. Perhaps it ended up in your spam folder." I knew she was lying. I never missed HOA emails, no matter how ridiculous they were. But even if I had, that didn't change the fact that what they had done was illegal. "You can't do this," I said, crossing my arms. "That was private property." Margaret's lips curled into a smirk. "Actually, we can. According to the HOA bylaws, the board has the authority to make changes to shared infrastructure for the betterment of the community." I scoffed. "Shared infrastructure? That was my driveway, Margaret. It wasn't part of any community property." She waved a dismissive hand. "It was an outdated design. The new road will improve connectivity in the neighborhood. I'm sure you'll come to appreciate it." I stared at her in disbelief. She really thought she could get away with this. The arrogance, the complete disregard for personal property. It was infuriating. Margaret, I said, my voice dangerously calm now. I don't think you realize who you're dealing with. I'm a zoning commissioner. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed her face. Oh, yes. Which means I know the law. And what you've done is a blatant violation of property rights and local zoning regulations. Margaret's confidence wavered for a split second before she forced a chuckle. Well, the board has already approved it, so I'm afraid there's nothing you can do. I smirked. We'll see about that. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway. The moment I got home, I pulled out my files on zoning regulations. As a commissioner, I had spent years studying the intricacies of property law, and I knew one thing for certain. Homeowners associations were not above it. I flipped through the documents, my eyes scanning for the exact clause I needed. There it was, in black and white. Private driveways fell under personal property easement rights. The HOA had no legal authority to alter it without my explicit consent. Even better, their so-called road extension violated multiple county zoning laws. They hadn't just overstepped, they had broken the law. A slow grin spread across my face. Margaret and her little band of rule enforcers thought they could walk all over me, but they had made a crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. I cracked my knuckles, already drafting the formal complaint I was about to file with the county. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. This was about principle. The HOA had been running unchecked for too long, terrorizing homeowners with ridiculous rules and unchecked authority. By the time I was finished, I had a comprehensive case laid out, complete with references to zoning laws, property rights, and legal precedents. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure they never pulled something like this again. The next HOA meeting was going to be a bloodbath. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a place that had been decorated to resemble a cheap hotel lobby. A few round tables were scattered around, each topped with a floral centerpiece that looked like it had been stolen from a 90s wedding reception. The fluorescent lighting buzzed softly as residents trickled in, murmuring among themselves about whatever petty disputes had arisen that month. I took a seat near the front, making sure my folder of documents was in plain sight. Margaret, already seated at the board's table, spotted me and gave me a thin-lipped smile. She knew why I was there. The meeting started as it always did, with mundane discussions about landscaping contracts and budget allocations. People debated the color of new street signs for an embarrassingly long time before someone brought up complaints about a neighbor's untrimmed hedge. I sat patiently, waiting for my turn. Then, just when it seemed the meeting was winding down, I raised my hand. I have a concern about a recent HOA decision, I said, my voice carrying through the room. Heads turned, and the murmuring stopped. Margaret straightened her shoulders, her fake smile tightening. Of course, Mr. Carter. What would you like to address? I stood up, holding my folder in one hand. The unauthorized destruction and repaving of my private driveway. A few whispers rippled through the crowd. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but I could see the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. As I mentioned before, she began smoothly. The board voted to extend the road for the benefit of the community. I flipped open my folder and pulled out the first document. Right. Except, according to county zoning laws, what you did is illegal. Private driveways fall under personal property easement rights, which means the HOA had no legal authority to alter it without my consent. A hush fell over the room. A few homeowners exchanged glances, their interest piqued. Margaret's expression remained composed, but I saw her fingers tighten around the papers in front of her. Well, she said, forcing a light chuckle, our bylaws state that we can make improvements to shared infrastructure. I smirked and pulled out another paper. Incorrect. Your bylaws don't override county regulations. And speaking of bylaws, I couldn't find a single amendment or vote record about this so-called road expansion, which means this wasn't even approved properly. A few members of the board shifted uncomfortably. A man near the back cleared his throat. Wait, we didn't vote on this. I turned to face the crowd. No, you didn't. And that's not even the worst of it. The county can fine the HOA thousands of dollars for this violation. They could also require the HOA to dig up the road and restore my driveway, all at their own expense. The room erupted in hushed conversations. Margaret's face had lost a bit of its color. She glanced at the other board members, but none of them seemed eager to back her up. I wasn't done yet. Furthermore, I continued. This is a pattern. How many of you have been fined for ridiculous infractions? How many of you have felt like you had no choice but to comply with rules that don't even hold up legally? A few people nodded, and suddenly, a woman in the front row spoke up. They fined me $200 because my flower pots weren't HOA-approved colors. Another man chimed in. They threatened to put a lien on my house over a mailbox that was 2 inches too tall. Now the meeting had turned. The homeowners weren't just listening anymore. They were getting angry. Margaret sensed the shift and tried to regain control. I assure you, she said, her voice tight. Everything the HOA does is for the benefit of the community. I shook my head. No, it's for the benefit of a few people at the top who get to make up rules as they go. But not anymore. With that, I pulled out the final paper. I've already filed a formal complaint with the county. There will be an investigation into this road expansion and other questionable practices. If found guilty of overreach, the HOA could face legal action. Margaret's composure cracked. You can't just go around reporting the HOA. I raised an eyebrow. Actually, I can. And I have. Silence. Then a man in the second row chuckled. Well, damn. The meeting unraveled after that. People started talking over each other, demanding explanations from Margaret and the board. Someone called for an emergency reevaluation of the HOA's policies. Margaret, realizing she was rapidly losing control, tried to call for order, but the damage was done. The homeowners weren't afraid of her anymore. They were angry. As the meeting descended into chaos, I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. This was only the beginning. The HOA had thought they could walk all over me, that they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was a zoning commissioner, and I was going to make them regret ever messing with my driveway. The next morning, I woke up feeling victorious. The HOA meeting had turned into a full-blown mutiny, and Margaret's once ironclad grip on the neighborhood had begun to slip. I had done more than just call her out. I had ignited something in the other homeowners, something they had been too afraid to acknowledge for years. People were tired of being bullied, tired of being nickel-and-dimed over nonsense, tired of living under the rule of an unhinged HOA board. But just because I had won one battle didn't mean the war was over. I knew Margaret well enough to expect retaliation. She wasn't the type to back down quietly. If anything, she would dig her heels in even deeper. Sure enough, when I stepped outside to grab my newspaper, I found a bright red notice taped to my front door. I pulled it off and scanned the text. It was a violation notice. Apparently, I was now in breach of multiple HOA regulations, including but not limited to having an overgrown lawn, installing an unapproved bird feeder, and using window blinds that weren't on the HOA's approved color palette. I let out a short laugh. Margaret was predictable, if nothing else. This was her attempt at punishment. She must have thought I would panic, that I would scramble to fix these so-called violations before she fined me into submission. But what she didn't realize was that she had just handed me even more ammunition. I sat down at my desk, pulled up the HOA's bylaws, and began drafting my response. The first violation, my supposedly overgrown lawn, was easy to debunk. The HOA didn't actually have jurisdiction over lawn height due to a county environmental ordinance protecting local grass species. The second, my bird feeder, was even easier. State wildlife support laws protected residents' rights to install feeders. The third, my window blinds, was laughable. The HOA had never officially filed that color regulation with the county, meaning it was unenforceable. Once I finished writing my response, I printed it out, making sure to highlight the legal references that backed up my claims. But I wasn't just going to send it to Margaret. No, I was going to send it to every HOA board member and every homeowner in the neighborhood. Margaret wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could play too. I stapled a copy of my rebuttal to the violation notice and walked it over to the HOA Dropbox, making sure to send a digital copy to the community email list as well. By lunchtime, my phone was buzzing with messages from neighbors who had received the email. Some were laughing. Others were asking if I could help them fight their own bogus violations. Word spread fast. By the afternoon, people started showing up at my house. My next-door neighbor, a retired veteran named Tom Jenkins, was the first to knock on my door. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone and had a reputation for not taking nonsense from anyone. When I opened the door, He let out a low chuckle and waved the printed copy of my email. "Son," he said, "I think you just started a revolution." I invited him in, and soon more neighbors followed. We gathered in my living room, swapping horror stories about the HOA's absurd fines and power plays. One woman, Susan, recounted how she had been fined $200 because her garden gnome wasn't considered aesthetically compatible with the neighborhood's theme. Another man, Greg, had been threatened with legal action because his car was parked half an inch over his driveway's boundary line. The more we talked, the angrier people became. The HOA had been terrorizing residents for years, using fear and intimidation to keep them compliant. That was when the idea struck me. I leaned forward in my chair, looking at everyone gathered in my living room. "We don't have to put up with this," I said. "We can fight back." Tom Jenkins smirked. "And how do you propose we do that?" I tapped my fingers on the armrest. "For starters, we can challenge the fines. If enough of us push back, the HOA won't be able to enforce them all. But more importantly, we can work to get the board replaced. The HOA isn't some untouchable entity. It's run by elected members. If we vote them out, we can take back control." The room fell silent for a moment as the idea sank in. Then Susan clapped her hands together. "You know what? He's right. We've let them push us around for too long." Greg nodded. "But we need a lot of support. Not everyone will want to go against the board." Tom chuckled. "Oh, I think they will, once they realize how much money the HOA has squeezed out of them over the years." It was settled. We were going to gather signatures, rally homeowners, and expose the HOA's overreach. The first step was proving that Margaret and her board weren't just overstepping. They were acting illegally. I had already started that process by filing a formal complaint with the county. Now, it was time to make sure the entire neighborhood knew exactly what was happening. The next morning, I printed out flyers detailing the HOA's biggest violations, including the illegal road expansion, the baseless fines, and the financial mismanagement that had gone unchecked for years. I included a call to action, urging residents to attend the next meeting and demand change. Then I spent the rest of the day distributing the flyers, slipping them into mailboxes, handing them out to dog walkers, and even taping a few to streetlights for good measure. By the end of the day, my message had spread. People were talking. The HOA was losing its grip. Of course, Margaret didn't take it well. That evening, she showed up at my doorstep, her usual fake smile nowhere to be seen. She was furious. "You are causing unnecessary panic," she snapped the moment I opened the door. "The HOA exists to maintain order, not to be attacked by troublemakers like you." I folded my arms. I think the homeowners would disagree. They're tired of being controlled by a board that doesn't even follow its own rules. Margaret's eyes flashed. "You're making a mistake, Carter. This little crusade of yours won't end well." I chuckled. "For you? Probably not." She exhaled sharply and took a step closer. "You think you've won something, but you haven't. The HOA has authority. The fines will stand, the road will stay, and you'll just be another disgruntled homeowner who learns the hard way that fighting the HOA is pointless." I held her gaze. "We'll see about that." She stormed off without another word, slamming my gate behind her. I watched her retreat down the street, feeling more confident than ever. Margaret still believed she could intimidate people into submission, but she was wrong. She had lost the neighborhood. She just didn't know it yet. As I turned back toward my house, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the county zoning office. My complaint had been received, and an investigation into the HOA's road expansion was officially underway. The war wasn't over, but I had just landed the first major blow. The days following Margaret's doorstep confrontation were filled with tension. The neighborhood had never been this divided before, but not in the way she had hoped. Instead of siding with the HOA, more homeowners started speaking up, sharing their own stories of ridiculous fines, unfair treatment, and arbitrary rules. The once silent frustrations of the community had turned into a steady roar of resistance. Everywhere I went, people stopped me to thank me for standing up to the HOA, and more than a few asked how they could help. Despite her usual arrogance, Margaret had to have realized that she was losing control. I could tell because her retaliation attempts became even more desperate. The very next morning, another violation notice appeared on my door, this time claiming that my mailbox was non-compliant with community aesthetics. It was the exact same mailbox I had installed years ago, one that had never been an issue before. It was laughable. Margaret was grasping at straws, trying to make my life as difficult as possible, hoping I would crack under the pressure. But every time she pushed, it only fueled my determination to bring her reign to an end. I didn't just ignore the notice. I used it against her. I compiled all the petty violations she had issued against me and several of my neighbors, then included them in the growing file I was preparing for the county. Every false citation, every bogus fine, every abuse of power was meticulously documented. The beauty of bureaucracy was that it worked both ways. If she wanted to use HOA rules as a weapon, I was going to use the law as a hammer. The next big move came when a county zoning inspector arrived in the neighborhood to assess the illegal road expansion. A few residents had gathered on their porches, pretending to go about their day, but clearly keeping an eye on what was happening. The inspector, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense attitude, didn't waste time. He took measurements, examined property lines, and asked pointed questions. I had given him everything he needed to prove that the HOA had overstepped, and he took his job seriously. Margaret must have caught wind of the inspection because she showed up halfway through, her usual composure replaced with a forced pleasantness that didn't fool anyone. She approached the inspector with a bright, overly cheerful tone that screamed damage control. "Oh, what a wonderful surprise," she said, clasping her hands together as if she had invited him herself. "I wasn't aware there was an inspection scheduled today." The inspector barely looked up from his clipboard. It wasn't scheduled by the HOA. It was requested by a homeowner as part of a formal zoning complaint. Her lips thinned, but she quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. The road expansion was done to benefit the community." The inspector flipped through his notes. "The issue isn't whether or not the expansion was beneficial. It's whether it was done legally. And from the preliminary assessment, it appears the HOA did not have the necessary permits to alter private property." Margaret's smile faltered. "Well, I'm sure we can get that sorted out." The inspector made a final note before looking up. "You'll have to. Otherwise, the county may issue a fine or require the HOA to reverse the changes." She didn't respond to that. There was nothing she could say. The moment the inspector walked away, she turned and locked eyes with me. For the first time since this all started, I saw a real panic in her expression. She knew she was cornered. That evening, another emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. The official notice claimed it was a routine discussion about community improvements, but everyone knew the real reason. The HOA was scrambling to contain the fire before it spread any further. What they didn't realize was that it was already out of control. By the time I arrived at the clubhouse, the place was packed. Usually, these meetings were attended by the same dozen or so people, mostly the board members and a handful of residents who had nothing better to do. But tonight, it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up. People who had never cared about HOA matters before were here, talking in hushed voices, waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret sat at the head of the table, flanked by the rest of the board members, most of whom looked uncomfortable. It was clear that not all of them wanted to go down with her. As the meeting was called to order, Margaret did her best to pretend like everything was fine, launching into the usual scripted nonsense about community values and property aesthetics. But she couldn't avoid the elephant in the room for long. Eventually, someone stood up and demanded an explanation for the illegal roadwork. Another resident asked about the zoning violation notice that had been delivered to the HOA earlier that day. The questions came faster than Margaret could answer them, and before long, the room had erupted into an argument. Homeowners were yelling over each other, listing their grievances, pointing out how much money they had been forced to pay in fines over the years. Margaret tried to maintain order, but her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of discontent. One of the board members, an older man who had always seemed reluctant to side with her, finally spoke up. "I think we need to reconsider how this is being run," he said. "There have been too many complaints, too many questionable decisions. Maybe it's time for new leadership." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face went pale. I don't think that's necessary. The board is functioning perfectly well." But it was clear that no one believed her anymore. People had seen the truth. The illusion of the HOA's power had been shattered. More voices joined in, calling for an election to replace the board entirely. The bylaws allowed for it, and if enough residents signed a petition, The current board could be removed. Margaret knew she was losing her grip on the HOA, on the neighborhood. It was slipping through her fingers. In a final act of desperation, she tried to turn the tables back on me. "This is all because of you," she spat, her voice sharp with frustration. "You've been spreading lies, stirring up trouble. You think you can just tear down everything we've built." I met her glare with a calm smile. "I didn't tear anything down, Margaret. You did that yourself." Silence. A long, tense pause before someone in the crowd muttered, "He's right." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but there was nothing left to say. The damage was done. The homeowners had spoken. The meeting ended in chaos, with residents demanding an official vote to replace the board. Margaret stormed out, her face twisted in fury. She had come into this meeting expecting to smooth things over, but instead, she had lost everything. As I stepped outside, Tom Jenkins clapped me on the shoulder with a hearty laugh. "You really did it, son." I smiled. "Not yet, but we're close." The war was almost over. Margaret just didn't know it yet. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and brutal. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with talk of what had happened. Word spread fast, and it didn't take long before nearly every homeowner was aware that Margaret had been backed into a corner. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now emboldened, realizing that the HOA wasn't some untouchable authority. The board was just a group of elected residents, and if they could be elected, they could also be removed. That single realization shifted the power dynamic entirely. By midday, the petition to hold a special election had gained more than enough signatures. I didn't even have to do much to push it forward. Other homeowners took it upon themselves to circulate the paperwork, knocking on doors, explaining to their neighbors why this was necessary. People who had never cared about HOA politics before were suddenly eager to be involved. It was a movement, and once it started, there was no stopping it. Margaret had lost the one thing she had always relied on: control. Of course, Margaret tried to fight back. She sent out desperate emails, warning that removing the current board would lead to instability in the community. She claimed that without her leadership, property values would plummet, rules would be ignored, and the neighborhood would fall into chaos. But no one was buying it anymore. People had seen firsthand that the HOA's so-called leadership had been nothing but a thinly veiled excuse to wield power over others. They had been manipulated, fined, and bullied for years. Now that they realized they had a say in things, they weren't going to let Margaret scare them into submission again. The special election was scheduled for the following week. Margaret and her remaining allies on the board did everything they could to delay it, but the HOA's own bylaws were clear. Once enough homeowners signed the petition, the board had no choice but to hold a vote. The neighborhood gathered at the clubhouse, and for the first time in years, it wasn't an exercise in frustration and bureaucracy. This time, it was a reckoning. When the ballots were counted, the results were decisive. Margaret and her allies had been voted out by an overwhelming majority. The new board consisted of a mix of homeowners, many of whom had never held any HOA position before, but were determined to change the way things were run. I hadn't intended to get involved myself, but I had been nominated and elected as well. It wasn't exactly a job I had wanted, but I wasn't about to let all this work go to waste. Someone had to make sure things didn't go back to the way they were. Margaret didn't take it well. The moment the results were announced, she stood up, red-faced and shaking, and declared that the neighborhood was doomed. She ranted about how no one appreciated the work she had done, how the HOA would collapse without her guidance. But her words had no power anymore. No one was listening. She wasn't in charge. She was just another homeowner now, no different than the rest of us. A few days later, she put her house up for sale. No one was surprised. She had built her identity around ruling the HOA, and without that authority, she had no reason to stay. She avoided eye contact with me whenever we passed each other, and I didn't bother rubbing it in. I didn't need to. She had already lost everything that mattered to her. With Margaret gone, the new HOA wasted no time making changes. The first order of business was addressing all the absurd fines and violations that had been issued under the old board. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined were reimbursed, and many of the arbitrary rules were either modified or removed entirely. The ridiculous restrictions on things like curtain colors, mailbox heights, and garden decorations were gone. People could finally enjoy their homes without fear of constant harassment. The biggest issue, of course, was the illegal road that had been paved over my driveway. The county's decision came down hard on the HOA. Not only was the board fined heavily for violating zoning laws, but they were also required to fix the problem at their own expense. The construction crew that had once torn up my driveway was back again, but this time, they were undoing their mistake. Watching them rip up the unnecessary road and restore my property was more satisfying than I could have imagined. Neighbors came by to watch, offering words of support and congratulations. Tom Jenkins brought over a couple of beers, laughing as he patted me on the back. "You really stuck it to them, didn't you?" he said, cracking open his drink. "I haven't seen this neighborhood this happy in years." I took a sip of my own beer and nodded. "Feels good, doesn't it?" He chuckled. "Damn right it does." With the HOA under new leadership, things changed for the better. Meetings were no longer exercises in frustration. Instead of being dictated by an iron-fisted board, homeowners actually had a say in how things were run. People were happier, friendlier, more involved. The fear that had once lingered over the neighborhood was gone. It was like the entire place had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the county zoning office. The investigation into the HOA's past actions had revealed more than just the illegal road expansion. Financial records had been audited, and it turned out that Margaret's board had been mismanaging funds for years. Money that should have gone toward neighborhood improvements had been funneled into ridiculous expenses, lavish HOA board dinners, unnecessary administrative costs, and in some cases, personal expenses disguised as community spending. The final decision was clear. Not only was the HOA fined heavily, but homeowners were also entitled to reimbursements for years of improper fees and penalties. It was the final nail in the coffin for Margaret's legacy. Not only had she been voted out, but her entire reign had been exposed as a fraud. Homeowners who had once grudgingly accepted the HOA's fines were now getting money back. It was a full-circle moment, and I couldn't have written a better ending if I tried. The night the reimbursements were announced, Tom Jenkins threw a barbecue in his backyard to celebrate. It wasn't an official neighborhood event, just a casual gathering of people who had been through the same battle and come out victorious. There was music, laughter, and for the first time in a long while, a genuine sense of community. People who had once kept to themselves were mingling, sharing stories, enjoying the freedom that had once seemed impossible. As I stood there, flipping burgers on the grill, I glanced across the street at Margaret's house. The for sale sign still stood on the lawn, a silent reminder of how quickly things could change. She had spent years controlling the neighborhood, convinced that she was untouchable. Now, she was the one leaving, while the rest of us stayed behind to build something better. Tom nudged me with his elbow, pulling me from my thoughts. "So what's next for you, Mr. Zoning Commissioner?" he asked with a grin. I laughed, shaking my head. "Hopefully, a quiet life without any more HOA drama." He chuckled. "Well, if that doesn't work out, you can always run for mayor." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help but smile. The battle was over. The neighborhood was free. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I wanted to be. Best driveway ever. The neighborhood had changed. The oppressive shadow of the HOA was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom and community that had been missing for years. People were no longer afraid to paint their houses bold colors, plant gardens that didn't conform to arbitrary rules, or leave their holiday decorations up past January. The new HOA board, which I was now a part of, focused on fostering a sense of unity rather than enforcing petty regulations. It was a fresh start for everyone. But even as the neighborhood flourished, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's departure wasn't the end of the story. She had left quietly, but I knew her too well to believe she would simply fade into the background. Margaret Hargrove wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I had a feeling she was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. It started small. A few weeks after the special election, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Margaret's. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a cryptic message. "You may have won the battle, Carter, but the war isn't over. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash, trying to dismiss it as empty threats. But over the next few days, strange things began happening around the neighborhood. Graffiti appeared on the clubhouse walls, defacing the newly painted murals that residents had worked so hard to create. A few mailboxes were vandalized, including mine, which was now dented and spray-painted with the words HOA Traitor. The incidents were minor, but they were enough to stir up unease. People started locking their doors at night, and the sense of camaraderie that had been building began to waver. I knew Margaret was behind it, but without proof, there was little I could do. Determined to put an end to the sabotage, I reached out to Tom Jenkins and a few other trusted neighbors. We formed a small committee to investigate the incidents and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. It didn't take long for us to uncover a pattern. The vandalism always occurred late at night, and the targets were always homes or properties that had been vocal in their opposition to Margaret's regime. One evening, as I was reviewing security camera footage from a neighbor's house, I spotted a familiar figure lurking near the clubhouse. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking Margaret's silhouette. She was dressed in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by a hood, but her posture and movements were unmistakable. I immediately contacted the local police, who agreed to increase patrols in the area. But Margaret was clever. She knew the neighborhood better than anyone, and she always seemed to be one step ahead of us. The vandalism continued, and the tension in the community grew. One night, as I was walking home from a late meeting at the clubhouse, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but the street was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I quickened my pace. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I spun around again, and this time I saw her. Margaret stepped out of the shadows, her face illuminated by the dim glow of a streetlight. She looked different, haggard, almost unrecognizable. Her once perfect hair was disheveled, and her eyes burned with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you can just take everything from me and walk away?" I held my ground, trying to keep my voice calm. "Margaret, this has to stop. You're only hurting yourself." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Hurting myself? You're the one who destroyed everything I built. This neighborhood was mine, Carter. Mine. And you took it from me." "The neighborhood was never yours," I said firmly. "It belongs to the people who live here. You just couldn't see that." Her face twisted in fury, and for a moment, I thought she might lunge at me. But then she took a step back, her expression shifting to something colder, more calculating. "You're right," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "The neighborhood belongs to the people, and if they can't see what's good for them, then maybe they need a little persuasion." Before I could respond, she turned and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, before pulling out my phone and calling Tom. "We need to talk," I said. "Margaret's not done. She's planning something big." Over the next few days, we increased security measures throughout the neighborhood. Cameras were installed at key locations, and residents volunteered to keep watch during the night. But despite our efforts, Margaret's next move caught us off guard. It happened during the annual neighborhood block party, an event that had been organized to celebrate the community's newfound freedom. The streets were lined with tables of food, music played from a makeshift stage, and children ran laughing through the crowd. It was a perfect evening, until the lights went out. The entire neighborhood was plunged into darkness. Panic spread as people stumbled in the blackout, trying to find their way. Then, from the shadows, a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "You thought you could get rid of me?" Margaret's voice echoed through the streets. "You thought you could take everything from me and just move on? Well, think again." The crowd erupted into chaos as people tried to figure out where the voice was coming from. I grabbed a flashlight and pushed my way through the crowd, shouting for everyone to stay calm. But before I could reach the source of the voice, a loud crash echoed through the night. The clubhouse was on fire. Flames licked at the walls, casting an eerie glow over the scene. People screamed and scrambled to get away, while others rushed to grab hoses and buckets of water. I shouted for someone to call the fire department, but my voice was drowned out by the chaos. And then I saw her. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. She was smiling, a cold, triumphant smile that sent a chill down my spine. I pushed my way toward her, but she disappeared into the darkness before I could reach her. The fire was eventually extinguished, but the damage was done. The clubhouse, a symbol of the neighborhood's unity, was reduced to ashes. The mood in the community shifted from celebration to despair as people realized the extent of Margaret's vendetta. But if Margaret thought her actions would break us, she was wrong. If anything, the fire only strengthened our resolve. The next day, residents gathered in the park to discuss rebuilding the clubhouse. Donations poured in, and volunteers offered their time and skills to help with the construction. The sense of community that had been growing over the past few months was stronger than ever. As for Margaret, she was finally arrested a few days later. The police had been monitoring her movements since the fire, and they caught her trying to leave town with a suitcase full of cash and stolen documents. It turned out she had been embezzling funds from the HOA for years, and the fire had been a desperate attempt to cover her tracks. With Margaret behind bars, the neighborhood could finally move forward. The new clubhouse was built bigger and better than before, with a plaque commemorating the resilience of the community. The HOA, now under new leadership, focused on transparency and collaboration, ensuring that no one person would ever have unchecked power again. As for me, I decided to step down from the HOA board. My work was done, and it was time for someone else to take the reins. I returned to my quiet life, enjoying my restored driveway and the freedom to live without fear of petty rules and vindictive leaders. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Tom Jenkins stopped by with a six-pack of beer. He handed me a bottle and clinked his against mine. "To the best damn neighborhood in the country," he said with a grin. I smiled and took a sip. "To freedom." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Maplewood Lane, I knew that we had finally won. Not just the battle, but the war. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.